Section 5307 today, and specifically into how Carpo developed its allocation formula. We want to even look at other places around the country that have other types of allocation formulas. We really want to think about why is it that the Federal Transit Administration gave authority to local MPOs to develop a discretionary type of allocation formula. So it's all things 5307 today. Yes, Dr. Mike.
I just got an email from Janet Payne saying she'll get here at 3:30. Teresa will be online to answer any questions.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. And also for purposes of those on our task force who are on our call today, Wayne Herron will not be joining us. Unfortunately for him, he's on vacation. And so I will catch him up on our discussion when he returns. Also, Pam DiGiovanni from NCDOT is going to join the call as soon as she can. I think she indicated that probably be closer to 4 o'clock. So we will greet people as they join us. But why don't we get started here? We've got a lot of ground to cover as usual, and just really appreciate everybody coming together. Now, this is I have task force meeting number 3, but I think it's actually number 4 after our launch meeting. Am I right, Dr. Mike? It's 3?
No, this is 3. We did,
You're right. We did
number 2 and the introduction number 1, and this is the dive into the current formula. And the 4th one is to look at all, if we want to reaffirm or change the formula.
That's right. That's right. Well, are there any opening remarks from our leadership before we,
as I say, before... Let me see if I was paying attention there.
I always pay attention to you, Dr. Mike.
More than that, I was paying attention.
Oh, all right then. Well, thank you for that. Anybody else before we get started here?
Well, I would just like to compliment you, Mary, and Jarrell and David for an extremely comprehensive analysis of the 5307 process and the rationale behind Carpo's decision. I think this is extremely informative and certainly the best explanation of it I have ever heard, and compliments to the 3 of you and others who participated and supplied information at this point. It really is quite good.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your comments. And I know that I'll speak for Jarrell and David. I know they do it also. We did work hard on this. And with no further ado, Theo, why don't we get going? We have our Zoom operator, Theo Thompson from Carpo, so we're ready to get going here. Well, first of all, let me just share with you exactly how we're going to roll forward today. First, we want to look at the purpose. Again, we're revisiting the purpose of Section 5307, both the purpose of the funds, how they can be used, as well as the match requirements. Something that David McDonald and Jarrell and Michael Johnson, actually, we met with him yesterday, and Judy Dellard O'Keefe to really put in the final touches for this program. Something that has struck all of us in our discussions is the fact that when you are seeking funds under Section 5307, you really have to think through a number of important variables. I mean, you have to be thinking about what can the funds be used for as between the pot of capital costs and then operating expenses. And those are very distinct usages. We're going to talk about that today. Decisions have to be made there. You also have to be thinking about the match requirements. Those are, that's money that communities have to be investing, have to be figuring out how they're going to get that money. And ultimately, our goal, of course, as an MPO is to maximize the total award of 5307 funds. So we really have to put our heads together and think about, how do we do that? How can we help each other in this process to make sure we get as much as we possibly can from this particular pot of federal funds? Then we'll describe, the disbursement process for 5307 funds, how it flows from the FTA and from the FTA forward. But we do want to look at that again because questions have been raised about that disbursement process. I truly mean questions have been raised. How does it work? What is the timing about? We want to touch on that as well. We're going to go behind the scene and look at, what is the statutory purpose underlying 5307 formula? Why is discretion given to an MPO and MPOs around the country when it comes to allocation formulas? We'll also look at where Carpo's particular formula came from. How was it developed? And we want to compare it to the ITRI and FTA formula that's actually contained in the statute as a possible way of allocating and then dispersing funds. And we will look for input from those of you who want to talk about this subject. I mean, it's important for us to have a clear understanding of the issues on everybody's mind, because ultimately, we are going to talk at our next meeting in detail about, does the formula need to be changed? And if so, how should it be changed? I want everybody on this call to be aware that, what Carpo is about is making sure that we maximize the grants from federal funds that are available to the entire MPO. So we're very open to this idea, all of us on this task force, of talking about how should the formula possibly be tweaked to make sure that that happens. All right, well, let's go forward here. And I think you're on, David.
All right, let's see.
Hey, David, before we get started, remind us how long you've been doing this work. Are you really as old as the crust of the earth?
Not quite. This end of this year, I will have been doing this state and local for 30 years. So this will be my 30th anniversary coming up.
And I feel like, sometimes with David, I feel like, and we had a long prep call this morning where we were talking through these issues. David almost knows too much about both the history, the changes, the current status of these various transit funding regulations. I have to get him to translate for me from time to time. So if we get to a point where you're scratching your head and saying, I don't know how this works, or I don't understand that, we welcome you to jump in and ask a question. David, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
All right, so we'll just dig in. If we go ahead and get started, first slide. So, the 5307, Urbanized Area Reform Program, we've kind of talked about this before, but it makes those federal resources available to the urbanized area for transit capital and operating, and that's a big thing with that. An urbanized area is over 50,000. You have to formulate an urbanized area and an MPO. But if you're over 200,000 in population, then you become basically a transportation management area, a large MPO, which means that now that federal money on the transit side doesn't flow to the state to be shared to the MPOs, it flows directly to the designated recipient in the MPO, which in our case, it's CATS for the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization. And, we've talked about this in the past and we'll go over it again, but the 2020 census coming up is going to affect the size of the MPO yet again, and will grow additionally. And growth is positive, and it means that we compete for more money at the national level, and more money comes to us. But also means that it affects how money can be spent and where it can be spent. So it'll kind of affect where people use the 5307 monies, and they'll become more reliant on it as we continue to grow. So let's kind of go forward. So just, a review of those eligible activities. We talked about this before. 5307 is the most flexible pot of transit funding. You can use it for planning, engineering, design, evaluation of projects. You can do other technical studies, and you can buy capital is a big piece. Bus and bus related activities, you know, building facilities, buying parts, all of those things are eligible capital costs. And then additionally, you can use it for operating expenses within limits. And so this is something that the federal government, it used to be if you're over 200,000, you couldn't spend it on operating. But in MAP 21, they changed that. And basically, that came about because you had some areas that had been small urban areas previously and were going to be larger urban areas. And it was going to be an impact to them to lose their operating funding. And so they created a special rule. So in areas over 200,000 in population, you can use operating expense if you have fewer than 100 buses. And this applies to Mecklenburg, Iredell, and Union based on the results of the 2010 census. But there are limits to that, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward, because the intent of the feds was to provide some operating funding to wean that agency as they grow off of federal funds for operating. In most cases, in large NPOs, the federal funds are wholly used for capital expenses.
Tell him wait till quarter after enroll if he doesn't see the guy. I mean, there's nothing we can do. He'll have to get a ride from somebody else. Maybe he already did. Who knows?
Yeah.
Jeff, can you put us on mute, buddy?
Jeff, can you mute when you're talking with someone else?
Okay. So let's go to the next slide, please. Uh-oh. I think she might have muted me too.
Uh-oh. No, we can hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So in 2000, this is what the urbanized area looked like. So you had small urban clusters for Statesville and Mooresville. And you can see the urbanized area that was, you know, the old Mecklenburg Union MPO. If you go ahead and click, so they'll go to the 2020 or 2010, you can see how the urbanized area expanded. And I think that there was a question from Michael Johnson in the chat box about, is the UZA population a countywide total or only the portion of the county in the UZA? It's only this green area. So the population in green is what makes up that urbanized area population, or the UZA population. And you see how much it expanded from 2000 to 2010. We would anticipate that, you know, probably more of that area that is, you know, around the fringes are going to start to be filled in. So after the 2020 census, probably all of Mecklenburg County will be green if we use the same color, and much more of Union, much more of Iredell, probably a little more of Lincoln, but we'll know that results in a couple of years, but you know, it's likely that we're going to continue to expand. And we will continue to grow within this urbanized area. This was a population of just over 1 million. That same area now, census estimate is over 1.2 million. Okay, let's go to the next. So, you know, once it's certified in 2022, we talked about that it will expand. You know, it also decreased the availability of 5311. So if you look at Union County in the area that is kind of that light, almost a crew color, I guess, or yellow background, that's the urban area today. So if you're having trips that, you know, are carried out in that area, you could utilize potentially 5311 funds or rural funds. As more of that area becomes urban, you won't be eligible to use the 5311. So we really should start thinking about the data and how we report it. If we have trips that are originating or ending in the urban area that also go to the rural area, so it's a, you know, trip that crosses that boundary, should really be looking at making sure the data that you report to NTD starts to reflect the urban side, so that when this boundary changes in a couple of years, you won't have to wait 2 years for the data to catch up with you, because you'll only be able to use 5307 funds on some of these areas in the future.
So David, go back to the first point on that, in the commentary on that slide about the census. Once the census is certified, it will most likely result in many areas becoming ineligible to use 5307 for operating assistance. And that comment goes back to the prior slide, doesn't it?
So, wait a minute, you can bring it back up. So 5307 for operating assistance, basically, we're going to talk more about this on another slide, but if you are an MPO with, or an organization with more than 100 buses, then you're not going to be able to use 5307 for operating. Right now, that's just CATS. Mecklenburg County is probably the next closest. They can only use, they're limited to 50%, but you'd still be able to use a portion, but you can't use all of it. There are more limits on how much you can use of 5307 than there is of the other rural funding that they've been used to getting.
So this is one of those issues that we talked about that I mentioned at the outset, where people really have to be paying attention to the impact of population growth on how they're going to be able to use different pots of funds. And here we're talking about 5307. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but if an agency is relying on 5307 for operating assistance, it may be that with the census results, that is going to shrink. That usage.
So 5307, right now, I think most of them are still okay, except for Mecklenburg. But yeah, there's going to be a limit. The Fed set a limit, and I've got a slide to talk more about that a few further in, and I'll make sure to point that out. But there is limits to how much can be used for operating. So continuing to grow your federal share, or your share of this federal 5307 funds, doesn't necessarily mean that you can use it all for operating. There is a limit, and the Fed set that, and that's still part of the law. And let's go ahead, and we'll come to that in a minute. All right. The other thing to kind of remember is the match is, you have to put 80% up for capital projects, or 20% match to capital projects, so you can use 80% federal money. There are limited projects where you can get a slightly higher match, but those are pretty limited. It's related to making sure you're complying with ADA, but usually you have to go above and beyond those requirements. And so it's a pretty limited amount that can go for 90%. And for operating assistance, 50% is all you can get. One of the things we talked about last time was when you start looking at operating, administrative is not included. So if you have an administrative position, that may not be included in your costs. You have to actually look at true operating expenses. And so you need to make sure that you're starting to understand the limitations of these funds so that you're not caught by surprise. And then, one thing that is true is that a match, you can use other federal funds to match it. The best example would be if you use Medicaid money. So you get an award of federal Medicaid funds, or you get, another grant from another federal agency, not DOT. Those funds would be treated as local money in this process. You could use that as a match. But typically that's been an important piece, I believe, for the counties. It's not something that CATS deals with that much, but that's an important piece to keep in mind going forward as well. And then, if you do receive 5307 funds and you operate a fixed route like we do and like Iredell does, then you must also offer half fare or reduced fare to people with disabilities. That's a federal requirement. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. All right. Let's do the next one. Okay, so this is the special role, and this is kind of a little bit of history, and so I'm going to go through these, but when we first did this, it's back in 2012, we started looking at coming up with a formula, Before 2012, if you were inside a large MPO, over 200,000 population, you could not use any of your money for operating expenses. They created this special rule with MAC 21, which was the federal legislation for transportation funding that was adopted that year. And it basically started out saying, if you operated a fixed route bus system and you had fewer than 100 buses, then you could use a portion of it, of your money to opt for operating. Let's click again and bring in some more words. So, and one more time. So in order to establish what that maximum operating shares would be, click it once more. They created this federal formula that basically says your agency's vehicle revenue hours divided by all of the vehicle revenue hours in the MPO, and you multiply it by either 50 or 75%, and then that gets multiplied by the allocation of funding to the MPO. So in our case, Mecklenburg is the only one more than 75 buses, so they're the 50%. The 75% are the other agencies. When we first did this formula, IRNet was the only one that was eligible to use this special rule. We click again, we move a few years ahead into 2015, and we get a new transportation bill, and this one was called the FAST Act, or FAST Act, Fixing America's Surface Transportation, and it expanded the rule. It basically opened up the special rule to not only fixed route operators, but also demand response operators. So that meant that more of Iredale's operations, Mecklenburg, Union, and South Carolina, so RFATS is the Rock Hill, Fort Mill Area Transportation Study, that's the name of their MPO, those areas also became eligible. And so if you have 75 or fewer buses, which that didn't change, then you can use 75% of that formula toward the operating assistance. If you've got between 76 and 100 buses, then you can use only 50%. And so the key here is that that's the formula that's set. Let's go to the next one, and I'll talk a little more detail about the local agreement part. So this is the table. This would be similar to what's called Table 3A in the federal formula. And what it says is these are each of the agencies in 2020 that reported operating within our urbanized area in Charlotte. And so there's the vehicle revenue hours for each, and the total at the bottom for the CRTPO. Now, in order to get to 1.2 million, CATS is 1 million of those. So we are part of that total, but we're not in this table because we have more than 100 buses. So we're not eligible to utilize operating money. But you can see the percent of vehicle revenue hours. And when you get over to the right, based on the number of buses, you see percent eligible for operating assistance. So everybody can use 75% except for Mecklenburg. They're only entitled 50 because they have more than 75 buses. The base federal formula amount, the maximum amount they can use, is based on that formula. So that 75% times their vehicle revenue hours divided by the total vehicle revenue hours for the MPO, and then multiplied by that $19.7 million allotment. So, for instance, Mecklenburg County, the most they could spend under that would be $763,047. There is a caveat, though. If we have a local agreement, so in other words, we have our own formula, then you can go higher for using operating money, but the feds limit that at no more than 10%. And so that last column on the right, if you did the math, each one of those is 10% higher, but that's the most that can be spent toward operating assistance from a federal perspective. Because you can spend, you have to match it at 50-50. You can imagine you double each of those numbers, and that's the most that you could spend on operating. So whether or not we change the formula or not, if we add more money, you have to realize that at this point within that table, that's the most that can go to operating. And after that, the remainder has to go to capital, for use of capital. And so that's an important piece if you're looking at and understanding that growing the pot doesn't necessarily mean that you can fully utilize all your money toward operating. That there is a limit, and that limit will continue unless the next law changes it. But
David,
this has been
question?
consistent. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there any pending legislation that you know of that would change this special rule?
So I will be the first to say that I don't know if there's any plans to change the special rule, but yes, there's going to be legislation to do another transportation bill. The current one expires at the end of this year, and so Congress will have to take that up. Our appropriations going forward will be under what's called continuing resolutions, where they'll give us part of the money until they come up with a new law. And so that's something that we would anticipate the money coming out. I don't know if they'll change this rule further or not. This gets down into the weeds of a very, very large bill. I would anticipate that they don't change it, but until they produce something, that's something we'd kind of have to monitor as an agency or as an MPO.
And just to clarify further, you said that the current federal transportation bill expires at the end of this year. Is that the entirety? That's not the entirety of the FTA, is it? Or
it's pretty much all the money for FTA and USDOT. So that's the conversation that they'll talk about, is that typically these are big bills. They require a lot of money, a lot of budget, and there's a lot of discussion over them. So once the federal government kind of settles into who's president and who's in Senate, then this is one of the bills that will have to be taken up to continue funding transportation. And, it's a massive bill, and it'll probably take, months and months to write and pass. And, it'll start from scratch, but there's a lot of give and play. There's a lot of play in how that goes and how they do it. In the end, though, in the interim, what will happen is they'll pass continuing resolutions, which means that we're going to continue at the same level as last year, but then that is subject to appropriations, which a lot of times means that, we'll get something to say, well, you can have 7/12 of what you normally get. And so that'll be reflected in the funding we get. So I would anticipate for the next year or two that the funding levels will be kind of in limbo or lower until that bill is passed.
thank you.
Okay.
Good to know.
The main takeaway here, and I know I kind of get in the weeds a lot, but this is that there is a limit of how much money can go to operating. I think it's a positive that we can look at making sure to maximize it by getting the extra 10% where possible, but that's the cap, and unless that changes with the next legislation. And it hasn't under the last two, so doesn't mean it won't change, but I don't know that that's a high visibility item that they're looking at. They're going to be looking more at the overall picture of the funding. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so that's kind of the information about 5307, and this is kind of talking into how we got to where we are with the formula. And we, some of this is going to be repeating a little bit, but so in 2014, the board approved the first formula, and those funds have been distributed annually ever since. And we'll kind of talk through how those funds flow from FTA through the recipients. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the only way to get the federal money is you have to be one of three things. You either have to be a designated recipient. In our case, it's catch. FTA prefers to have only one designated recipient in an MPO. The second is to become a direct recipient, and the third is to be a subrecipient. So, and each one of those have meaning in federal regulation. As a designated recipient, CATCH is responsible for the full pot of money And then because we do have a local formula, we utilize and calculate the shares or split of the federal funds. And we send a letter every year to FTA that divides the money up amongst the other recipients. And so CATS is a designated recipient. NCDOT in 2012, we started out with ICATS was going to become a direct recipient. They were not able to complete that process in time for the allocation in 13 and 14, I guess. And so what we did is we held them as a sub-recipient for a couple of years. In 2015, when more areas became eligible, we had a conversation and we sat down with NCDOT. NCDOT is already the designated recipient for rural monies and for those MPOs that are less than 200,000 in population. They already had a relationship with Iredell County, ICATS, with MTS in Mecklenburg County, and with Union County. And so NCDOT said that they would become the direct recipient on behalf of those three agencies. Those three agencies remain sub-recipients to NCDOT. So the way the money flows is once we calculate the formula of how much goes to each person, we send out the split letter, which means FTA then puts it in a different silo. This is CATS money. This is money for Iredell. This is money for Union. This is money for Mecklenburg. And here's money for Rock Hill. And then on the North Carolina side, NCDOT is the official funds for the three counties. They then write the grants directly with FTA, and they work to have agreements between NCDOT and the counties in order for them to receive those funds. All right. And then in South Carolina, yes.
Question. What does it mean that NCDOT has responsibility for subrecipients' use of 5307 funds? What is that responsibility?
So whoever is the designated or direct recipient, they are legally and financially responsible for how those funds are spent. So to ensure that ADA is met, that all the procurement and contracting follows the federal regulations. If something isn't met, I'll give you an example, and the easiest one is buses. So you purchase a bus. There's you're required to keep that bus for a certain number of years before you can retire it. Let's say that bus was in an accident, no fault of whoever, just put that to the side, and it was destroyed. It couldn't be reused. That bus still had federal interest in it. The feds want their share of money back based on what useful life was supposed to be left. So if the county would have to be reimburse NCDOT, they're going to reimburse the state to the federal government. In the case, another issue is you buy a van to operate. At the end of the useful life of the van, you sell it as surplus. If it garners more money than the value that would be considered the salvage value, anything in excess of a certain amount has to be either returned to FTA or you have to work with them to roll it into the value of another grant. And so, but those financial pieces, there's a tremendous amount of oversight and responsibility associated with every capital asset and every action that is taken. And so from FTA's perspective, they're not going to chase all the way down through the subrecipients. They focus on the direct recipient. They're the ones that have the contractual relationship with FTA, and they require them to meet those requirements, and they require them to reimburse them if they don't. If you do something illegal, they're going to hold you responsible to that. And so then that agency has to have that oversight of their subrecipients. When CATS does that for, we have to do that for a smaller pot of money that we put out for a call for projects. We take 10% off the top for administering that to help oversee that process and pay for that cost. because NCDOT already has a relationship with the counties, and they were already sharing money. They didn't charge that oversight. They're continuing to do that. But they also have, NCDOT is in a better position to be able to collect funding if something goes amiss than other agencies would be.
And David, does that account for, I don't want to get into a lengthy discussion here, but a question arises. Does that responsibility for the subrecipient's use of funds, does that account for why there's sometimes a lag time perhaps between when NCDOT gets the money from CATS and actually distributes it?
Yeah, so from a grant writing perspective, they're literally entering into a grant. So NCDOT is going to write the grant with FTA. In order to do that, they have to have data from the subrecipient. So there almost has to be an agreement from the state and local level that then gets entered as, you know, state and federal level. There's multiple steps here to ensure that all the contracts are in place for spending that money. You know, and so there's a lot of work that NCDOT does undertake as part of that process. But if you're going to get into much more depth of questions related to how that works, I'm going to have to let Pam or someone from the state answer that. Now, one thing that is different is that we talked about as areas grow, they sometimes grow out of the formula, they sometimes grow out of different programs. Mecklenburg County, under the next census, is likely to have no rural area left. NCDOT said several years ago when they started this process that they would act as the direct recipient for the counties, but that when Mecklenburg County no longer received rural money, then there was no incentive for them to continue that role. Mecklenburg needed to go out and become a direct recipient and work directly with FTA. And it's my understanding that that's what Mecklenburg County is doing now, is they're getting prepared to become certified as a direct recipient and be able to write those grants directly to FTA in the future. So, you know, they would move to the same. Yeah. Okay. So they're moving to the same status as basically RFATs in South Carolina, and could be same status as the state. And that's how CATS handles it. We write grants directly to FTA as well. So, okay. So I know that's a lot, but those are important distinctions of how that money kind of flows.
And with everybody's permission, when Pam DiGiovanni joins us, I think we'll just go back to this and see if anybody has any questions related to this, because I know that our colleagues who are in these respective agencies may have a question that is important to them. So we'll just revisit this at the right time.
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We've seen this one before. If you could just keep clicking. This is the overall federal formula, and I know that we talked through it in some detail last time, so I'm just going to skim through it. Let's see, and one more, and then we'll stop. Okay. So starting at the top, you get the appropriated money at the federal level. This is the federal formula in a flow chart. And we follow the federal formula all the way down until we get to the last bullet there. So we calculate the fixed guideway piece and we separate that out. On the bus tier, we calculate the incentive portion. When we first started, CAS was the only one that supplied data for that. Now Mecklenburg County does. And so, you know, they get a share of that incentive piece that's calculated directly by the federal formula. And then everything that's non-incentive goes down to that last column. And then what makes that up is bus vehicle revenue miles, population, and population times density. You start getting into a much more difficult piece to kind of split. And so this is where we apply the local formula at this point. So let's go to the next
David,
slide.
if I may,
Yes,
this slide might be hard for some people to read. I don't know if everybody realizes you can increase the size of the slide by going up to
Yeah.
view option, which should be at the top of your screen. There should be a button of navigation called view options. If you click on that and you go to zoom ratio, you can pop it up to 100% and then just move us, all of our faces, kind of off to the right so that you can take a closer look at this particular slide. But David, if I understand it, this is basically, you know, the federal formula for allocation of 5307 funds. And you're going to explain to us now why Carpo made a decision to go to a different formula. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Let me see what the next slide is. Frankly, we pulled this together so short. I apologize, but let's go to the next slide. We're going to start talking about, you know, kind of the focus on the, you know, understanding why FTA allows you to be able to have a local formula and why they leave that to the discretion of the MPO. The key factor in that is that every area is kind of different. You may have different goals, different objectives. And so FTA is leaving that authority and that information within the locals' hands in order to make decisions based on their unique needs and unique situations. And so I think this is one where you're going to kind of share in some of this too, Mary.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say, you know, in addition, of course, to, you know, working with David, working with Jarrell to develop the information that's being shared with you, I did some independent research myself, as probably many of you have done, to better understand, you know, how 5307 is supposed to work. What is the nature? Why is local discretion given to an MPO to adopt a formula that, you know, serves the purposes of that MPO, et cetera? And one thing I found that I actually was very interested in is to see that a lot of MPOs around the country are struggling with the issue of the proper allocation formula for the 5307 funds. This is not unique to Carpo. This is something that is being looked at by different MPOs, because if you think about it with me, and we've seen this in Carpo, you know, the population has changed so dramatically. What's rural, what's urban has changed dramatically. What we want to do in our area is quite different. You know, the way that we want to travel around it, the way we want to use public transit, all of that it's just the nature of it to be in a transformational state all the time. The needs of our population, you know, what people, many people don't really want to be vehicle reliant. Maybe many is the wrong way to put it, but there are a lot of people, especially a different generation, younger generation, who don't want to be as reliant on vehicles to get from place to place. So all of these changes are going to necessarily impact, you know, the profile of public transit in a particular region like Carpo. And so the feds, in their, you know, I guess wisdom, decided that there would be local discretion when it came to how public transit funds could be allocated across an MPO. And we're actually, in our next program, I'm going to charge a couple people, I hope they'll accept the charge, to do a little bit more research on what's going on in some of the other MPOs around the country, because we have been doing that right along, but I think we need to get a couple examples that we can share with y'all that will be in addition to what we're going to share next. So if you want to go to the next slide, Theo,
Yeah.
some of you will have seen this information before. And again, you might want to enlarge this a little bit by using that view option at the top of your screen. You might want to enlarge it to 100%, and that would mean you couldn't see all of us, but that's okay. But do you recall, this comes from that report that has been circulated among us a couple of different times. And I always have to look up what the meaning of TCRP is. It is the oh geez, Transit Cooperative Research Program. It was a resource. This transit a cooperative research program was founded in cooperation with the FTA itself to look at issues related to transit across the country and potential changes to law, to regulation that might be needed. And so they're sort of, I guess, a think tank, if you will. And I saw Jarrell nodding his head, so I think I'm not telling you anything that's not correct here. But there is a report published by this group that we are specifically interested in, having to do with the process for sub-allocation of monies pursuant to 5307. And what the organization, this is a diagram that I took right out of their report. They looked at what are the goals that MPOs are trying to collectively achieve across their region. And by identifying the goals that are trying to be achieved, you can then extrapolate a model that is going to best serve your particular localities and region. So take a look at this with me, if you will. The two, there are three factors that stood out in particular when this organization did its study. And again, back in 2014, so this is 6 years old. It's a little bit dated, which is one reason why we want to look at, some additional research. But the factors that were considered to be most significant to various MPOs across the country, you can see them there, the two that score 19 and the item that scores an 18. Let's go to the next slide so we can look more closely at, it might be hard to read the bottom of the screen there, but there it is at the bottom of the slide. The top three rationale for MPOs developing their sub-allocation formulae is to support projects with these criteria. So the goals were to preserve existing public transit, check. The second goal, to promote efficient public transportation. That was the next highest vote getter. And then the third, which tied it, was to improve coordination among modes of public transit. So with these targets, these goals in mind, formulae were then developed to serve those purposes, which I think is a really interesting thing for us to be aware of and to start thinking about as we talk about making changes to the formula. It's going to be very important for this task force to think about what is it that we are in fact trying to achieve. Both, we know there's a local perspective, but we also know a lot of our people want to take public transportation to go around the MPO, not just within their community. So let's go to the next slide, Theo. I want to share this with you again. You might recall that we looked at this in our first task force meeting, which we had back in the summer months. And I shared with you, some of you were in fact able to participate in the Carpo board retreat in May of 2019. And it was as part of that Carpo board retreat. Remember, the board was considering at that time whether to authorize additional resources, mainly human resources, people, to be hired to join the Carpo staff. And we thought about the fact that maybe we need to develop some common planning guidelines that would be helpful to Carpo whenever there were decisions to be made. And they're necessarily general in nature, right? Because, we wanted them to serve as maybe a ruler, a metric that we could compare, various situations to. So I bring these to your attention again, because these may be useful and helpful to us as we think about, what are our goals for transit planning and transit operation, public transit around the community. Maybe they do have to, looking at the first one, maybe we should have as a goal supporting this enhanced transportation network rather, that crosses the region, including upstate South Carolina and other parts of the state. The second guideline would be to make decisions that protect and enhance the region's economic drivers, ensuring parity across the region when we think about those drivers. And you could read the third one as well, integrating land use considerations consistent with local vision and other important regulations and requirements, multimodal transportation needs, as well as vehicular road use. That's what transit is a big part of. And then finally, not making decisions based on what I want or what you want, but really thinking about facts, data, public input, and working collaboratively to plan the transportation system, adjusting to the needs right now, but also thinking about the future. So just wanted to remind you of those planning guidelines. They may be useful to us as we identify and state the goals we have for how we want our 5307 allocation formula to work. So Theo, having said that, let's go ahead. And now we can take a little break, everybody, if you would like to. I'm going to give you a 5-minute break. If you want to get up and, I know Zoom calls are, tiresome to a lot of people. Maybe, just rest your eyes, do something else for 5 minutes. But we'll come back together at 4 o'clock and continue our program. I have about, let's see, what do I have right now? I have 3:52. Oh, so you're actually getting more than 5 minutes, friends. Getting 8 whole minutes, right? But take a break and we'll come back.
Okay, do you mind a little bit more detail on what the issue was?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure that there is an issue, but we just wanted to understand your viewpoint on the process. David is not knowledgeable, about what the process is for the disbursement of 5307 funds once, they are sent to NCDOT by the designated recipient. So we just wanted to ask you to explain it to us.
Absolutely. Happy to.
All right. So hey, Theo, we can go back to slide 13. When everybody's got a few more minutes of break time until 4 p.m. We're here. And I'm so glad that before we go on, and next we're going to be talking about the development of Carpo's formula, again, based on, certain goals that were in mind at the time, a number of years ago, which, as we just said, may have changed somewhat. Before we move on to talk about the underpinnings of the Carpo formula for 5307 allocation, I just thought, since Pam DiGiovanni from the State Department of Transportation has now joined us, I thought we'd just go back to this slide. It was earlier in the program when we were talking about the disbursement of how funding flows from designated recipient to direct recipient and then to subrecipients. And Pam, we were just talking about the fact that, NCDOT has a legal responsibility, a statutory responsibility for how the subrecipients use the 5307 funds. And so we were thinking that you must have a process by which, as direct recipient, you get those funds, but then, the process for dispersing them and the, sort of arrangements that you make with the subrecipients. We just wanted to know a little more about that.
Yes, Mary. And I just want to thank you and the TEI for welcoming me into this group. It's been a great pleasure. For those of you who don't know, I'm the interim supervisor for the West region for the newly merged integrated mobility, which was the merger between Bike and Ped and the PTD division. We have the responsibility of facilitating the federal dollars to the subrecipients. As you know, this 5307 funds is only federal and the local funds that go into this program. There are no state dollars. So what happens is, well, the end of the federal fiscal year is September 30th. So typically the FTA releases the authorized allocations sometime in a November and December timeframe. Split letters are then distributed and disseminated typically in the springtime, helping to facilitate this process. When the money comes down from the federal government, the state opens up applications typical to within the same time frame that the 5311, 5307 applications are released to the subrecipients. A 5307 operating and capital application is opened for the subrecipients to submit and enter in their funding into our EBS system. We have a suite of required documentation that complements this funding request to adhere to federal guidelines and statutes. Typically, that is in the fall process. It is then reviewed on 4 different levels by internal staff within the planner, the mobility development specialist planner on a tier 1, supervisor level on a tier 2, and then it moves on to our finance division and other signatories within that process. In the early spring, like a February time period or March, it will go to the Board of Transportation for their approvals. Once the Board of Transportation approves the projects within the 5307 program, these funds need to be entered into the TRAMS system within our finance division. The TRAMS system is the federal sort of itemization system that they require to assist in facilitating these grants. The capital needs to be itemized, and the admin and operating is just a general suite that's entered in. For lapsing funds, the deadline that we need to adhere to enter in is a March 30th deadline. For non-lapsing funds, it's an April 30th deadline. Our finance unit then assists in facilitating the final signatories for the agreement to go out by the end of the state fiscal year, June 30th. At times, these contracts are delayed just because of the volume of contracts that are going through the process, but typically it is within, the end of the fiscal year, new fiscal year. And then once the agreements are issued, then claims are typically submitted on a quarterly basis to draw down on those agreement funds. Oh, you're muted, Mary.
That is a complicated process. There's a lot that goes into it.
Yes, there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen to make sure that everything is adhered to on that federal level as that state sort of intermediary to facilitate that funding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it really is a lagging activity, isn't it? I mean, the split letter comes out, but the funds are not distributed then until all of these activities are completed, which is the next following year. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, well, it needs to go into our business enterprise system so we can create that application and agreement in which the claims can be drawn down and tracked and accounted for. So that we can satisfy the federal reporting requirements. So federal reporting is due at, I think the deadline is at the end of October. So we need to report on the funds that we assist to facilitate.
I see. And presumably all these, the various local transit organizations that you are distributing, you know, that to who are subrecipients from NCDOT, this process and procedure is well understood, and it's, you know, funding is managed given the lag of time or the time it takes to enter data into trams and then to make the awards.
Well, it's an education process. You know, we are continually educating our subrecipients on the process and thanking them for their patience, you know, because, you know, if there's one snag in this intricate marriage between BOTs and trams and documentation, it can cause delays. So, and we understand that, you know, they need the funds to, you know, they're where the rubber meets the road, but there are intricacies in the process, and we communicate those as we go. So, you know, there's been a delay on the FY21 5307 agreements because trams has shut down, and now trams is opening up in November, and we're utilizing trams in November to log in these items within the 5307 applications. Because so
Wow.
you know, the process isn't perfect, but it's a process.
But from CAT's perspective, then, as the designated recipient and then the direct recipients, so CAT's is designated, and then I think I have here direct NCDOT, RFATS, the Rock Hill area, South Carolina recipient, and soon MTS that is working to become a direct recipient. The flow of funds is much more prompt, it sounds like, to a direct recipient. Maybe that's a David question.
So I would say that, you know, the way Pam described entering into the TRAM system, which is the, Jarrell typed it into the chat box, the Transit Award Management System. That's basically the platform, the software that FTA uses to manage all the grants throughout the country. We do the same thing that, you know, once we've determined how we're going to utilize the federal funds that are designated for CATs, we have to write a grant or a series of grants within that system. And so what's happening on the state side is they're having to get information from the locals based on how to spend their money. And then they have an agreement on that piece on the state side, but then they turn around and put that into the grant with the feds. We're just directly working as putting the grant in with the feds. So we have a little less, but we also, as a bigger organization, we have some of that interaction department to department in communicating what needs to be in that grant and how to process it. It is a complex process. It's very formalized in dealing with the FTA, and it's because you're dealing with a lot of federal money. And there's you know, checks and balances to make sure that all of that money can be accounted for. And every 3 years, we go through a triennial review where they look at how we just, you know, spend all our money, check that we followed all the federal regulations, all the procurement regs. That's a week-long process where we go through a very detailed audit with FTA. They bring in a team from outside to do that. They do that with the state as well. And so as the designated or direct recipient, you're subject to that kind of scrutiny.
Wow.
Which means you have to do that with your subrecipients as well.
Wow.
And that's correct. I just want to echo that with David. So the state is doing all of that trams facilitation for the subrecipients to access the money, and we do go through that same triennial review with the FTA every 3 years to ensure that we are facilitating the funds in cooperation with their guidelines and regulations.
Wow. That is very complicated. Thank you for explaining that. To me, that's very helpful to know that, you know, again, it just adds another layer of planning for these local these smaller transit agencies that are part of Carpo.
May I ask one question? Just in trying to make sure that I understand that. So the trams component, obviously so this is Janet, sorry, from Union. We utilize trams, obviously the state facilitates that, but what other than that, if I understood David correctly, CATS also uses trams. They just are the ones who facilitate the initial entry, and we provide the information, and then I guess NCDOT uploads it into trams, or maybe we do it directly. Teresa probably can speak to that, but what is the difference? So I know when we do the triennial review, that's technically a review that NCDOT does, but we also have to participate in that and have like a 30 or 40 or 50 page document that we have to fill out with lots of different questions, and they come and they do an audit, obviously on site and that kind of thing. What are so it seems like we do the same things, we just do it through NCDOT as opposed to doing it directly, but I feel like I'm missing something, probably, in terms of being a direct recipient versus a subrecipient.
So you're pretty accurate. Basically, the difference between the direct or designated and subrecipient is that the designated or direct recipient has a direct relationship with FTA for entering the grant. And they're the ones that the agreement is between FTA and that direct or designated recipient, which means that's the agency that FTA will go to in order to, seek if there's any issues, if, funding needed to be returned, something wasn't done correctly, those are the responsible parties to FTA. So then NCDOT then turns around, my understanding, and Pam, correct me if I say this wrong, has an agreement with you guys as their subrecipient. And so it's passing through an extra step, but it means that you can then, get the federal funds, they're flowing through NCDOT, but they'll have an agreement with you, and they have a parallel agreement with FTA for those funds to flow. On the CAT side, when we're dealing with FTA, it's based on the funds that we've, through the split letter, designated to come to CAT. So it's directly the projects that we're working on and not others in the case of 5307. Pam, does that sound right? Or do you have anything to add?
No, you summed that nutshell up perfectly.
Does that answer your question, Janet?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking. So the benefit, I guess, of having NCDOT is that they can be an advocate, and in theory and typically, I think also in practice, from what I have seen, they would have people who would maybe be more experts to then hopefully give us guidance at the local level, as opposed to us at the local level having to make sure that we fully, so we still have to complete, obviously, the application. We still have to complete the reporting. We have to provide everything that then DOT would provide to the FDA. It's just they're the go-between, which can be nice sometimes, maybe to have a buffer.
Right, Janet, and I think one of the key issues or opportunity for the transit systems to hone in on is to really have an accurate view of which capital items you're using it for, how operating is going to be, because to change it, to go back and to change it at times on the back end can be really add more to the process. So I think sort of that, really defining the planning that goes into those applications is going to eliminate any delay in agreements.
That makes perfect sense. And then only one other question, since we're this deep into it, is there any difference in the reporting that is done? So, and I know this is like part of a question that has come up in terms of, my brain just went completely blank, but the 31A, the David, the thing that we've talked about that the direct recipients report 2 additional components in terms of mileage. I think we do revenue.
Janet, we can't hear you.
And
Yeah, you're gonna have to go.
Yeah.
sorry.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
you just, yes.
But so I guess what I'm wondering is does NCDOT report, as the direct recipient, does NCDOT report this same data that you as the direct recipient has to report? And if so, why wouldn't that show up for the individual entities that NCDOT reports for?
Okay. I think we may be confusing National Transit Database entry versus grant entry. So with the grants, these are very specific. You say you're going to implement a project. For example, we're going to buy 2, 3, 5 buses, whatever it is. Then you're reporting on the progress of that grant. That's the data that's being entered into TRAMS. And then as part of that, that also and I'm getting outside of my depth of knowledge, that becomes a fixed asset you track as well. On the other side, though, when you're reporting annually on the data that goes in the National Transit Database, which is the data that is then going into the federal formula, that's a different piece. That doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the grant process. That's how you report your National Transit Database information. And based on our conversations last time, and I'd look for Pam or Ty from ITRI to comment on this, is that my understanding is that each of you guys are reporting that information directly to FTA or to the National Transit Database through FTA and not by the state. But I'll let them clarify that. Is that kind of getting at what you're asking?
Absolutely. That's exactly because, and
Okay.
I think I was confusing it because of the whole direct recipient, designated recipient component that is associated with the way that NTD data gets reported.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's like a apples and oranges sort of thing. So according to Jeremy, who assists in facilitating the op stats, Union submits it to the state, but Union is a direct reporter on the op stats to the NTD, which he stated. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Hi, Kai.
Hello, Pam.
All right.
Pam, I have a
But
question.
That's interesting. I wonder why they wouldn't capture all the same data then in the reports that are produced. Like in the final NTD information or FTA information that's distributed.
Well,
So
go ahead, Dave.
go ahead. No,
I was gonna-
definitely you should go ahead. You know more about this than I do, to be honest. I don't know a lot about the NTD.
I was just going to ask for clarity. What final documents are you talking about, Janet?
David, help me out because I'm not looking at my notes, but the
So I think what you're talking about is some of the incentive stuff. So the vehicle revenue miles or passenger revenue miles divided by operating costs. So you can be a full reporter to the NTD, which means you provide a lot of information, or you can be a reduced reporter. And so what Union and Iredale are showing up as is, and South Carolina for that matter, you're all showing up as reduced reporters, which means that reduced reporters don't have to provide as much data, and that's one of the data columns that they don't have data in. So whether that's you didn't submit it or because you're a reduced reporter, it's automatically removed, I don't know. That would be a question I would look to see for somebody who knows a lot more about NTD process than me. And so I'd look to ITRI on that.
I put the link in the spread in the chat box of the table that everyone's referencing. So basically what the table is referencing, a small systems and or reduced reporter do not have to report to two of the columns in the said table on that link, and it'll take you to the Federal Transit Administration's website. Full reporters report everything. And Charlotte is considered the 38th largest area in that Excel spreadsheet chart from the National Transit Database. So that'll clarify what everybody's talking about for those who may not know.
Yeah.
But there are two, while the data is used to some extent in developing the amount that an entity is entitled to under 5307, an NPO is entitled to under 5307. It is not, it is used for multiple purposes. It's not just used for that purpose.
That's right. It's also used in the distribution formula currently, right?
Well, let's get to that because that's coming right up.
Okay.
How's that?
So that,
and I think Michael Johnson might have Michael, did you want to make a point now or tell me?
Well, I'll wait on the other point, but I do want to say this. And Pam, you correct me if I'm wrong, but in conversation with your ITRI representative, my understanding was that ICATS and UCT, they did not report to NTD for either of those organizations. They did it directly. Am I mistaken in that?
That's right. ICATS reports their own NTD data, and so does Union and Mexico.
Right. So in terms of NTD, ITRI has nothing to do with that.
That's not totally true. We do still have to put it in a rural report that's got 5311 numbers, and they need to match. But
they do not verify the veracity of the data. They just formulate it in a form. Is that correct?
Oh, when you say they, are you talking about NTD or
ITRI? Yes, ITRI.
Well, right, we don't ever see the data before it's submitted.
Okay.
Cede the rest of my time, madam.
All right, sir. Let's move forward. Okay. Theo, we want to go back up to slide 21 now, because now we're going to get into how Carpo's formula was developed and compare it to the we call it the ITRI recommended formula. Maybe that's not exactly right, but it's.
Please don't call it that. That's not a recommended. It's just a disaggregation of the federal formula.
All right, fair enough. Did everybody get that? It's a disaggregation of the federal formula. And we're going to ask you more about that, Kai, in a minute. But David, back to you.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, Theo. So we talked about, before we took the break, some of the data that was used at the national level. That report, when it was being developed, was about the same time that we were starting to look originally at developing a local formula. So unfortunately, it wasn't available yet for us to kind of use. But we did consider some key factors or goals in the development of the formula that was adopted by the NPO, and we've been continuing to use ever since. And so 5 of those items here, we want to make sure that the data that would be readily available without significant collection efforts. You start looking at trying to parse out population. Sometimes you have to go in and do a GIS exercise to be able to try to get to that. And that's, data intensive, it's labor intensive. So we wanted to be able to pull information from the National Transit Database. We wanted it to be able to accommodate the future expansion of the NPO and growth in transit agencies and adding additional agencies. We've just gone through a census, so we knew that the NPO had grown. We knew that that would happen again. And then we also, a couple of years later, because of changes in the law, additional agencies became eligible to use it for operating. And so we wanted a formula that was flexible enough to be able to adapt and see other agencies added. We kind of anticipated that there was going to be more coming down the road. And then we wanted it to recognize, the operating and capital needs. So this is kind of almost like looking at, you got existing service out there. We want to make sure that we are taking into account the operations that are there. And the last one is we wanted an incentive, kind of a performance measure that we wanted to be able to promote and reward transit growth and improve performance. And so that was the goal that we were trying to implement with the formula that we were looking at. So let's go to the next slide. So, in order to do that, like I said, we didn't have that compilation of data. It wasn't yet available. So we looked first at inside North Carolina, well, what's the next largest MPO? The next largest MPO is the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization in the Raleigh area. And so they used a modified version of the 5307 federal formula, or the ITRI, interpretation of the federal formula. Now in that area, they had, the Capital Area Transit System, which is now Go Raleigh. They, at the time, had 100 buses and 240 demand response vehicles, but those 240 demand response vehicles are taxis. So it's kind of an odd number. It's higher than it probably would be normally. Triangle Transit, which is now Go Triangle, also operated in that area. NC State operates the Wolf Line, and Go Cary, the Cary Transit System, they operated 11 buses and 18 demand response vehicles at the time. So the way they use the federal formula is they try to follow every category of the federal formula, that big spreadsheet or that flowchart we had before, except when it comes to population. When it comes to population, they calculate the population of Cary's city limits, and then the remainder of the population for the entire MPO, the entire urbanized area, goes to Raleigh. And so that's how they do that. And they revisit their formula every 5 years. And what they've said to me is, when they look at this, is the most controversial piece of that is how to handle the population portion of that formula. And so that's the piece that it really doesn't work if you added a new agency or you expand. You have to go back and kind of revisit the formula to decide how you're going to split that up. The other one we looked at was we wanted to look at
David.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You used a term before that I didn't understand. You referred to GIS mapping.
Yeah.
So what is that?
Yeah. So Geographic Information System. This would be, using a tool by a company named Esri or some similar tool that I'm not the expert in, so I may need some help from Jarrell or someone else, but it allows you to geographically look at data. And so it ties maps and data together. It's a large database. There's tons of information out there. But when you start trying to take an area and split it up, it's very difficult to parse that data out. And GIS is a tool that's used to do it, but it can require a lot of effort to be able to come up with that information. And it's something that you'd have to have a procedure so that you would make it repeatable and get the same results. But I know that in the case of the Triangle area, for instance, they do that kind of calculation for the low-income funding, which is a piece of the population. The reality is that's a relatively small amount of money, and so it's a lot of effort for parsing out that difference. And so a lot of other agencies, what they do instead is just assume that it's proportional. And that's what we do between North and South Carolina. We assume the low-income population is proportional to the overall population. Is it accurate? Probably not. Is it close enough? Probably. Is it faster? Yes. And so those are the kind of things you start getting into, is having a formula that gives you, an absolute answer versus a formula that gives you close enough so that you can move on without spending a month calculating it. So
I in the chat box responded what is GIS for everyone to be able to read. It's basically, in lay terms, it's electronic mapping. It's basically used to pretty much show what it looks like from space on Earth, basically, so you know where what everything is.
Okay. So if I'm gonna go back and let's click again and look at Los Angeles. So in trying to look at other large MPOs, we had access to LA because our director at the time had come from there, and so she was able to put us in contact with the folks that had developed and operated the formula in that region. And you know, Charlotte is a growing area, certainly not as large as LA, and I don't anticipate us being as large as LA in my lifetime. But you know, it gave us the ability to look at how others had handled it when they have a lot of other entities, so that you could manage growth and as you get bigger. So they had 17 different transit agencies in the MPO, and they utilized a formula that was, you know, they took 1/3 based on vehicle revenue miles, 1/3 based on the fleet size, and then they used 1/3 based on a combination of fares and ridership. So we looked at this formula and we modified it some in order to be able to move forward. And so click again, we'll go to, I think, the formula that we ended up with using. So initially the action was taken in 2014, and then it was, confirmed again in 2017, was that we have 1/3 of the formula, 1/3 based on the annual vehicle revenue miles, 1/3 based on the fleet size, using bus equivalents at 44 seats per bus. So we can use NTD data, we get the number of seats for the entire fleet, we divide by 44, that's the number of buses you have. So that provides parity between a van and a over-the-road coach or a 40-foot bus. And then we did 1/3 share based on ridership, and we dropped the fares piece because we felt like there was a greater disparity between fares for demand response versus fixed route systems. So we left that piece out at the time. Additionally, we followed the federal formula all the way down, as we'd shown before, to that last box. Only when we got it to the point where you're trying to understand the difference in populations or bus vehicle revenue miles or population and density, where it's very difficult to kind of parse that out, that's where this formula is applied. All this data is readily available from the National Transit Database. It's something that this is a repeatable process. It's something that anyone can go in and verify the data and repeat it. Although it takes me a little while to do it, I'm sure that someone with some Excel skills can also do the same thing and understand that you come up with the same answer. And that's the goal, is that we have a public formula that is repeatable and that anyone could duplicate it and get the same answer. Okay. So if we go forward to the next slide.
Could I ask a question? David, yes. you prorate it by equivalent buses. You could do the same thing if you just looked at total seats and did it proportional by just total number of seats. You'd get rid of.
We could, yes.
You get rid of that one division step.
Yep.
There's a question in the chat box, guys. From there's a couple points in the chat box that we should look at in real time. Ron? You asked about the similarities between the Charlotte MPO and the LA MPO. And let's go to that first.
So I'm not going to say that we're the same size by a long point, but I think the similarities we were looking at is that LA had many agencies spanned a pretty vast area. They do not cross state boundaries, but they cross multiple county boundaries, and they have multiple agencies. As we looked at a formula anticipating our growth, we felt like that was something that would be similar to Charlotte, that as we continue to grow, we thought we'd have more transit agencies within our region, and that we would have more reliance as we switch from a combination of urban and rural to more urban over that region, that you'd have more agencies at the table relying on these funds. And so we wanted a formula that could adapt to that as those changes occurred. The census population data only changes every 10 years. So, you know, Raleigh revisits it every 5 years, but the formula we have, if someone, you know, starts operating and they submit their data in 2 years, they're going to show up in the formula and we could automatically add them. And so we felt like it was something that could take that into account and add agencies as they expand and keep up with them with the data.
And then Ron has a follow-up question. Do we anticipate other transit agencies joining or coming to Carpo?
So if you look at our urbanized area from 2010 and anticipating the growth, we already extend into Lincoln County. We extend into Cabarrus County. Cabarrus County's operations extend into Charlotte. They showed up in our data for the first time. I anticipate that we will cover much more of Lancaster and York County in South Carolina. And it's likely that, you know, it's possible that we could expand over into Gaston County. Now, typically what we have done in the past is those boundaries of is that urbanized area has expanded beyond our political boundaries. We've done an agreement where we say, okay, we're going to continue to allow you, the other MPO, to retain responsibility for planning of that portion of the MPO. And typically, we've also said we'll each keep our own monies. We won't share it, mainly because the amount of overlap has been relatively small, or maybe we'll go over in one area and they'll come over in another. If after the next census, we have a lot of area within that surrounding county, I could see them standing up and saying, well, we need some of those funds to help us make ends meet and to be fair. And so this formula would be able to recognize, for instance, potentially Concord's system. Or by that time, I could see Lincoln County saying that, yes, well, we provide service in that area now. It's expanded enough that the trips are only urban. And so for us to be able to fund those trips, we may need to get a share of the Charlotte money. So yeah, I would think that potentially we could see other agencies at the table requesting utilizing these funds. Okay.
Pam,
and
yeah, and Pam has a point here that she made. It's incumbent on the subrecipient. This is going back to NTD. Can everybody see that comment in the chat box?
I can read that one if you want, but it's, you know, she's saying that it is incumbent on the subrecipient to enter the accurate data to NTD, and it should be checked and verified in their audit. The state verifies data to ensure accuracy with the programs, and then the NTD also verifies the data. I think the key here, we've kind of talked around this, but this is an important point, that if we're anticipating that urbanized area expanding, if you're reporting a trip today that starts in the rural area and ends in the urban area as a rural trip, then it's going to show up in the 5311 data, and it's going to generate funds that come to North Carolina to share. But after the census, if that area is urban, then NCDOT is not going to be able to spend that 5311 funds in that area. You're going to be relying on 5307 funds for that area. And if you reported your data on the rural side, the rural got more money, but the urban potentially got less. If you reported on the urban side, anticipating this change, and the fact that the data you report today will not be utilized for 2 years, which should coincide with the redesignation of the urbanized area by the feds, then you know, once that area is urban, you could then apply for it and utilize it from the 5307. And hopefully we'd be growing our 5307 pot as a whole, so there's more money to share by whatever formula we end up with.
David, isn't that, David, isn't that what happened in 2017 with UCT and ICATS in the gap in their 5307?
It is. In the past, as these things had kind of changed, the state had some more flexibility to, cover it with state funds or to help cover it with state funds. But as areas keep growing, as North Carolina becomes more and more urban, their ability to do that was lessened. And so, it meant that those agencies needed to reach out and find, 5307 funds to accommodate some of those trips. That's perfectly legitimate. That's why we developed this formula to share it. And that will continue as we continue to grow.
But could we also assume that 2-year gap that occurred at 2017 with the change in the urban area, unless there is accurate 5307 reporting, that there could be the same cash flow gap again to these smaller entities?
It's possible. What will happen is they'll get a share of the 5307, but our overall pot will be smaller. So everyone will get a little less money than they could have gotten had the data been reported to maximize the money we get out of 5307.
Oops, let me unmute myself here. Janet Payne just typed a item into the group chat. I think, David, for you, when you mentioned that, and everybody can see this, I'll just read it quickly. When you mentioned that the funding for population-based components, poverty, et cetera, is minimal, what do you mean, or what does that mean? If I understand correctly, that data is used by FDA to determine funds, quote, earned, unquote, by the MPO, and that is the primary component used by ITRI as well in its calculations of, quote, earnings, close quote, by county. Meaning that component is ultimately the primary basis of our initial concern about the current MPO formula distribution.
Okay. So I've got a slide that will speak to that. So I've showed you that flow chart of how the money flows. What I've done is, in another slide, is I've broken it down by each of the components that make up that total $19 million of award. And I can show you by each line, and I've kind of lumped them in a category of population, of vehicle revenue miles, and then, fixed route and incentive, what each piece means and how they add up. So I can show you that, that piece. Nothing's insignificant. It's just, what percentage of the total it is. And for low income, it's a smaller piece of the total, but I'll be happy to show you that and talk through that. We'll get to that in a minute. There was also a note in here from Ron Schultz, who said, do we anticipate, you asked about anticipating other transit agencies, and you said, isn't Concord part of another MPO? They are, but, so is Rock Hill. But because we trade off that urbanized area in South Carolina rather than becoming a bi-state MPO, because on the federal highway side, roadway dollars, federal roadway dollars goes directly to the state. It would go to the state of South Carolina, so they still have access to those. But on the transit side, those dollars come directly to the designated recipient. In this case, it's CAT. So it does come to our MPOs. So the only way they have access to those federal funds is through this formula. So they are getting some of the funds for South Carolina, even though they're in another MPO. And I would anticipate that that would still be something that may come up as we continue to expand and we grow together. We're already 4 MPOs in this region. We have Charlotte and Center. You have, is it 5? Sorry. We have Charlotte in the center. We have Concord to the east of us. We have Gastonia to the west of us. We have Rock Hill to the south of us. And Drell is right. I can't count. To the north is Hickory. Yeah, northwest. So, yeah, we're touching each other. Yeah. So, I'm looking back up the slide. So once we applied that formula, this is the percentages of how the share shakes out. If we go ahead and click and go to the next slide, we can look at it as money. So in FY20, this is, how it was, the final numbers, and this was based on adjusting for 5339, and we talked about 5339 as the bus and bus facilities money, and we assign it proportionally, and we give more 5307 money in order to clear that. So I don't want to get into those details again, and we pulled that out of the conversation or out of the presentation. But if there's any questions on that, I'd be happy to kind of address those to the side. But then this is the final. So the 19.7 million, you can see the shares that goes what goes into the split letter. And then each of the agencies, NCDOT works with those three in North Carolina to write the grants and seek those funds from the feds. CATS works directly with FTA to write those grants. And RFATs, they do the same thing. They work directly with FTA in South Carolina for that one. All right.
David, I'm going to let you go to the next slide here because I think it is responsive to Janet's question.
I think it
but
is.
Then Ron Schultz has another question in the box. So let's go to 27, Theo, and we can talk to, and again, you might want to go up to the top to view options and enlarge this slide because the type is teeny tiny and my old eyes are having a hard time seeing everything that's there, but you can enlarge it by going to view options. Go ahead, David.
Whew. So it's not quite fitting in my screen, so we cut off part of the bottom here in this thing somehow or another. Let me see if I can adjust mine to, okay. So we talked before about that whole spreadsheet or that flow chart. This is each of the individual categories of data that go into into FTA's formula for, how the money comes to CRTPO. So they're running this calculation, when they do population, it's our population as a percentage of all the other MPOs greater than 1 million, and what our percentage is. And so our apportionment comes out to be about 4.2 million. So it's about 21.6% of the total amount we received in FY20. When I said that low income was a smaller amount, it's not insignificant, but it's 3.5%. Growing states is 6.5%. When you add all of that together, about 41% of the money we receive from FTA is based on some form of population. Bus vehicle revenue miles is about 42% of the total. And then bus incentive, fixed guideway, and fixed guideway route miles and fixed guideway incentive adds up another 16.8%. All of that together should add up to the 100% of the 19 million and change that we get. And so this is, the federal formula. Now, the problem comes in when you try to start sharing that. Before we go to the next slide, I'll look at the thing from Ron. And he's asked to explain the union and ICAT share reduction. What I'll say is that was something that is we had a note when we first started this, based on the data was that if you only had data for the whole county, you'd have to reduce the data to pull out the rural piece. We've never done that because within NTD, we're able, since we started, the National Transit Database separates urban from rural data. So we only deal with the urban data reported to NTD based on the urbanized area. So we've never had to use that reduction feature. There's a column in there for reduction. There's nothing in it, and so you can see that the calculated number and the applied number at the end are the same number. So, can we go to the next slide, and this will be talking a little bit more about kind of comparing our formula to ITRI or why we have some concerns with how the entry formula was applied in the presentation made to Union County, for instance. So when they did those the calculations for the shares based on what was presented to Union County, instead of using, when they got to population, you have to determine how to parse out the population. They utilized only the city limits of Charlotte, which would be the kind of the white area on the left as the population for CACs. But our service area for CACs that we provide to FTA and that we operate is on the right. And our service area, our service draw is greater than that. So in I-77 for the North Corridor, for instance, we have park and ride lot in Davidson, Cornelius, 2 in Huntersville, 1 in North Charlotte, and we're in the process of adding a 6th that will be another one in Huntersville. Those park and ride lots draw patrons from surrounding counties that are driving into Mecklenburg and parking and riding transit into employment locations in uptown. It's the same thing that we have when we look at the park and rides along light rail. When we go and look at we have to do a before and after study. Unfortunately, the one that which collects data about ridership and where people come from, a big portion of that is called an origin and destination survey. You know, when we did the last one, which is several years old, it showed that, you know, the South Corridor, the light rail, which is the blue line there, that people drove from as far away as, you know, Lancaster and beyond in order to ride the train. Rather than drive all the way into downtown, they drove, parked, and then completed their trip by transit. We were hoping to be able to do an updated one of those surveys after the Blue Line extension was open, and we're scheduled to do it, and then COVID hit. And so that's been delayed because nothing is really kind of normal right now. But that's something that's kind of good to capture information. We do it for our entire system. It's something we've talked about is maybe we should be expanding that and try to do that on a regional basis, looking at kind of all of the operators in the future. But it gives you a good indication of, you know, where your service is reaching to. This is why, you know, we felt that, you know, the way that the federal formula was being applied wasn't accurate. And it's very difficult to try to parse out that population data. In Raleigh, again, what they do is everything goes to the city of Raleigh except for the town of Cary, which operates their own fixed route and demand response service. They have a full transit system that is comparable to the Raleigh system. And so that's one of the issues that we kind of saw and had concerns with.
David,
I want to go to the,
there's another,
yeah.
David, there's another question that Teresa Torres from Union County poses to the group. Why are we using a formula for 5307 allocation that all agencies can't report full data to? Wouldn't it be advantageous to find a formula where the agencies can report all information that will give the best possible outcome?
So the only data that is not being considered is the incentive tier. Can we go back one slide? The incentive tier for bus, that's 4.89%. Right now, that's only being shared with Mecklenburg County because we're the only two submitting the data. And so I think what she's saying is we should use a formula that recognizes that. The problem is that we're using the federal formula at that point. The federal formula doesn't have their data, and so no money is being given to the region based on that lack of data from Union County and from Iredell. If they become full reporters and submit that data, it would show up and it would be recognized and calculated. That's where we are continuing. We're following the federal formula at that point. It's only when we get past that point that we apply the local formula. And in that local formula, the three key pieces, everyone provides data that is used. Everyone provides data to NTD that is being used. So we don't have a formula that doesn't recognize their data. We have the federal formula doesn't recognize their data because they're not submitting it. Okay.
Okay.
Let's go forward
And,
2 slides.
David,
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
another question from Ron Schultz. He says, can you show the spreadsheet showing that the service reduction is not being applied? The info on the PowerPoint presentation given to the Carpo does not reconcile. I'm not sure I understand that.
The one given to Carpo was that he's looking back at a slideshow from 2017 and 2014 where we made that note anticipating we'd have to do the reduction, but we were able to identify data that didn't require that. And I can absolutely show that. If we want to get through the presentation, we have time, and you want me to pull up the actual spreadsheet for 2020, I can show you where the column is set up for the reduction, and I can show you that it is 0.
Okay. Another question from Janet. Let me just read this to the group. The federal formula defined funds earned based on population, correct?
Federal formula defines the funds as what as you have shown on your screen. There is a piece for population, and that's about 21.6%. The population times population density is 9.7%. Federal formula has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 distinct pieces for our region. Every single one of those is used to calculate how much money we get.
And the only thing that's cut off on this page, David, is the totals at the bottom. Yeah.
That's correct.
The 9 components are displayed.
That's correct. And anybody that wants to, I will walk you through and you can see them. The federal government, one of the things they provide, or we'd never be able to even follow the federal formula at all, is that when they do their calculations by each of these items, they provide basically a multiplier. They say, based on all of the data, then if your population is this, you can multiply it by this constant. That gives you your population share. And the first thing I do when I do this formula is I recreate the federal formula to the MPO level to make sure that everything balances, that we're not missing any data. And once I can confirm that, then we go to the next step. There's sometimes, with rounding, it's going to be off by a little, but it's usually within very, very small deviation. And then once all that's calculated, then we can, if it's off by a few dollars, we reconcile it to the total amount so that it's, it comes up to the penny. And I can walk anybody through that they want. Yes.
Another question from Janet. Regarding the ITRI formula, and again, apologies to ITRI, it's not technically the ITRI formula. Are you saying it doesn't include all the population of Mecklenburg County? And that's based on the prior slide that you showed.
Yeah, what they did is they only gave Charlotte, CATS the credit for the city of Charlotte. The population for the remainder of Mecklenburg County was shown to Mecklenburg County, which would have made them look like they're getting a lot more than they should have, considering that the amount of service between the two is vastly different.
Okay. Another question from Ron at this point. Please further explain the methodology in the 44-seat bus equivalent.
So the methodology there, and Dr. Miltek is absolutely right. We could just use seats instead of using equivalents. But what you're doing is, in order, for us, if we have 5 40-foot buses with 36 seats on them, what we're doing is NTD data tells you the number of seats within your fleet by type of vehicle. And so we can add all of those seats up, we divide by 44, and we come up with an equivalent number of buses. So for CATS, our demand response vehicles don't equal 1 bus per vehicle. It ends up being a fraction of them, just like it does for you guys. we're saying that, to standardize, we're doing bus equivalents. That could be changed to percentage of total seats, and it would give you the same number. Okay. I mean, the main reason to do that is that the operating cost for a van is different, and the cost of the van is different than the operating cost and the cost of a bus that's a 40-foot bus. And it's trying to recognize the difference in those. You got to try to provide an equivalent. Okay.
Good questions. Lots of good questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Another one. What are the cost, David? What are the cost differences?
Okay, hang on a second. What are the cost differences between what? I'm not sure I'm following that one.
Yeah, we need, maybe Ron, can you explain it?
So, yeah,
Sure,
Ron, let me guess. Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was just thinking since it was a follow-up to the statement that was made just a second ago, I'm guessing that it was about the cost to run the different types of vehicles.
Okay, your total is $5.
So why we're using the seats.
Yeah, so I see that he added too between the different bus sizes. And so to put things in perspective, I lost the presentation. Where'd we go? So to put things in perspective, let's talk about capital costs. The capital cost of a van, maybe, I don't know, I'm gonna throw out a number because I don't know it, but it's probably about $50,000 or something, maybe 60 or 70 if you put the lift on it. That's probably on the high side. It's probably less than that. But the capital cost of a 70's right, great. Then if you look at the capital cost of, say, a 40-foot bus with the fare boxes, cameras, all the other equipment that we would install, there probably, if it's a hybrid bus, it's more. If it's electric, it's even more. Those are going to be probably in the 500,000 range and up. So there's your difference. You go and you get a cutaway vehicle for ISTS, our paratransit service. It's going to have fewer seats, but it's going to probably cost in that $70,000 to $100,000 range as well. So there's the capital side. And then on the operating side, whereas, maybe a van gets, I don't know, I'm going to guess, say 12 to 15 miles to the gallon, and a bus, 40-foot bus is probably going to get about 1.5 miles to the gallon, 2 miles to the gallon. Hybrid maybe gets about 3. And these are my guesstimates of that value, because I haven't kept up with, what those numbers are. You guys would probably be able to answer better about what your cost, what your miles per gallon are on various vehicles are. But the key is that there's a disparity. There's a difference between a smaller and a larger vehicle. And so what you're trying to do is come up with an equivalent for that. If 44 seats is not the way to do it, or if seats is not the way to do it, then, that would be something, as we get further into this presentation, we talk about next steps, proposing a different piece for that in order to equate them. And I think that that's absolutely a reasonable thing to consider.
May I ask a question instead of writing it?
Sure.
Just because I think it may be easier to say it than to type it. So thinking about that, and I heard what you just said about talking about it later. So this may be an ill-placed question, so we can talk about it later if that makes sense. But I'm thinking, so the reason that we have it in the formula is to account for the differences in the cost of the operating and capital cost of the different types of vehicles. But wouldn't we sort of account for that by virtue of the fact that we're using the number of riders? And so obviously ridership, you would expect on the larger vehicles that cost more for there to be a higher number right, of riders on fixed route. That typically is the case. And so wouldn't that sort of already account for the, for that component by giving credit to the additional number of riders and the additional number of miles? Doesn't that sort of take care of that, as opposed to giving credit for that plus then giving the credit for the number of seat equivalents?
So I understand what you're saying, and I understand the point. What we were doing by assigning a portion based on the fleet was to try to get at the kind of the capital cost related to the bus, which is something that's fixed where you carry anyone or not. And then the ridership was more of a performance measure of, you know, how successful you are. The reality is, with a fixed route system, you're going to run the bus, you know, all day. And they're just like on the highways, you go out at the peak and it's going to be full. You go out at the off peak and it's going to be empty. But for consistency's sake, you still have to run buses. You don't run as many, but you run them. With you guys, you have peak times as well, also within your system, and there are times when you're only carrying one passenger. So, you know, when we did it, we saw it as two distinct pieces. If you eliminated the number of buses and relied on ridership, you'd probably have to increase the percentage share based on ridership, you know, within the formula. But yeah, all of those things are fair game for, you know, thought and discussion going forward. The other thing that I see typed in here from Ron is that he asked about the lifespan of the larger buses versus smaller. And, you know, we keep the large bus, we're required to keep it, I think 12 years by FTA. In order for it to last 12 years, it has to go through a midlife overhaul where we replace the engine and the transmission. Whereas for a van, I think it's 5 years. Y'all will correct me if I'm wrong. And then for other buses, there's various lifespans where you have to keep it that long before you can retire it. And then, yeah.
I just want to interject here. We're really getting into the weeds, everybody, and there will definitely be time to get into the weeds. I'm not trying to cut off conversation. And that's really what our next meeting is going to be about, is to really drill down. But we want to get to, we want to complete the program at this point in a timely way for y'all. And, you know, go ahead and keep posting questions as they come up.
Yeah.
They'll be recorded. We'll make sure we address them. But David, do you want to, does anybody disagree with that idea that we need to move forward in the time we have? Dr. Mike,
no, because the way we're going, we're not going to have any time savings for you guys.
Yeah. The weeds is the next session, like you said, Mary.
All right.
Okay. Sorry about that. I appreciate it, but I wanted to make sure we weren't leaving anything out. So let's move to the next slide and go ahead, and I think it's 2 down, because the next one we've already talked about. You go one more. So now we're up to the point where we start talking about what's next. You know, how do we kind of look at, if we're going to change the formula and we need to base that on real data. You know, what we did with this slide, and I'm going to let Mary talk to this some too, is that on the left side, I've kind of pulled the first 3 items from that CRT, what is it, the comprehensive report, the cooperative research report. And then the other bullets on the left side are paraphrased of those goals that were developed by the MPO. And on the right side is the kind of the goals that we developed when we developed the formula. And you can see how some of them align. So, you know, preserving existing public transit kind of aligns itself, or I thought it did, with recognizing operating and capital needs. That promoting efficient public transportation kind of went along with promoting and rewarding transit growth and improved performance. You know, improving coordination among modes of public transit wasn't really considered on the right side, but it is kind of considered, or kind of lines up with promoting multimodal needs within the MPO's priorities. Looking at enhancing regional transportation network, kind of felt like that aligned somewhat with accommodating new transit agencies and growth within transit agencies. But we, protecting and enhancing economic drivers and integrating land use, is not really recognized. And on the right side, accommodating a future MPO expansion and growth in public transit. Maybe that kind of goes with enhancing the regional network, but it's one of those things where it's, these are some of the ideas that are out there. So trying to start a conversation of what are the ideas, what are the priorities, what are the goals that we want to achieve if we're going to look at addressing the formula so that it achieves those goals. And then I'll see if Mary has anything to add to that.
No, I mean, David, you basically, what people see on this slide is, as David said, those first three items on the left, came right out of that Transit Cooperative Research Program report. Those were the top vote getters, the top factors in coming up with the, a formula by other MPOs. The bottom five, as David said, those relate to, the guidelines that the Carpo board came up with at its retreat in 2019. And then on the right, you see what David looked at and Carpo and proposed to Carpo when the 5307 formula that's being used now were first developed. And is we color coded them to show you that, there's a lot of similarities on the left side and the right side, but now we have an interesting task, as a task force, which is, which of these factors, and maybe the factors that are important to you and maybe should be important to all of us are not even listed here. Maybe there are other things that we need to think about. What are we trying to achieve with our 5307 formula? And remember, we rise or we fall collectively. We're trying to achieve something for every transit organization across this MPO. We just have to decide, how we want, what do we want this to look like? So it's going to benefit all of us, as we move forward. And then think about that 5-year component that Campo has, for its formula. Is that the right look back period? It probably is. I mean, I don't think you want to look at this, every 2 years. Is there enough significant change over what period of time? Maybe it is 5 years. And if it is, then we're overdue to look at this formula. So thank you all, for, making everybody aware that, it's time for us to take some collective responsibility for what do we want this to be like in order to achieve the goals in the region. And Theo, if you just go to the final slide, this kind of wraps up this portion of the program. When David and I, and we talked to Michael and Jarrell as well, and we talked about, what are the next steps? Our next meeting is when we really want to we want to start a little bit high level, and then we want to come down to a granular place where we're talking about goals for the region, but then, and also local considerations. And then we got to get into, okay, well, then what are the components of the formula? This is what I came up with as, our next steps in our process. I think, I didn't participate in all of the one-on-one discussions between the local agencies and our task force leadership, but the ones I did, I found to be very useful and helpful in terms of understanding local needs. So some of our agency folks who are on the part of the task force, we may want to set up another one-on-one discussion now that we're at this point in our process, so that each of you feels like you're being heard when it comes to the way the formula is presently and what the goals and formula specifics ought to be going forward. We'd welcome that. Another possibility is, to look at, and I haven't studied this, the Centralina Organization of Governments. Did I get that right? COG? Is that what it stands for? All right. So, COG's regional transit study. There may be pieces and parts from that we should be looking at as we, consider goals for what we want to accomplish. And I don't know where that stands right now, where that process is, if they're at the point of making recommendations or still in a discussion mode, but I know some of you do, and you might think that's a good idea. Having local discussions, and this is on, our local agency members. Some of you, I think only Union, if I'm not mistaken, although Mecklenburg, this could be the case too. There have been changes in political, the election was just held, the census is coming up. Maybe there should be some local discussions within, the various localities about, what do we need to accomplish under 5307? What are we trying to do? How will the census impact us? Should we change, the nature of the way we characterize trips based on, what the census is likely to bear? But for everybody on our call, I have these two assignments. I will, this report has circulated among us, the Transit Cooperative Research Program's 2014 report. We'll check to see if that has been updated in any way. And if it has been, we'll get our hands on that. But I would like everybody to read this. It's actually, I read it. It did not, I didn't fall asleep, and I actually understood it. So, this will give you a foundation for all issues related to the 5307 allocation formula. Now, I know some of you have already read it. Ron Schultz, for example. I know that you have studied this. So, but everybody who's part of our task force, that needs to be an assignment before we get back together again. The other thing I thought, the final point in yellow there is, Jarrell, we need to go out and collect information from other MPOs, and especially those that are somewhat similar, to our MPO. I know you have been doing that, kind of anecdotally and, tapping people, around the country. Maybe we need a couple volunteers to help us with this, for purposes of just, making sure we kind of fan out and we gather information that is relevant to what we're trying to achieve and the way that our MPO works when it comes to public transit. So I'm going to reach out and ask for volunteers on that in a separate email message. What else, David?
No, I think that's good. I was going to say that, I can help with that. And, maybe we can reach out to the Association of MPOs as well. It might be helpful in doing that.
And we already got our first volunteer. Thank you, Ron. Well, I'll be calling on you so we'll figure out what the path ahead is. Let me ask one other thing that popped up for me at least had to do with the reporting of trip data to the National Transportation Database, given that that data is going to be utilized, for purposes of deciding funding. Does anybody want to speak to that? Any of our leadership?
Yes, Mary, I'd like to speak to it. I think that, and I can't remember exactly the year, but in looking at the NTD on our reduced reporting, there was one year that in terms of the urban participation, there were just zeros. And I think I hope that one of the things that we have gleaned, I know I certainly have gleaned from this discussion today and this reporting, is that the financial viability of all of our systems rests, as we grow in the urban sphere, rests in the maximization of 5307 funds. And I think that needs to be a primary goal as we look forward to future steps. It's tough to do anything about history, but we know that we're going to have a change in population. That change in population, and Pam, if I speak incorrectly on this point, I hope you will correct me, but it certainly cannot increase 5311 funding in this state or in our particular MPO. It's got to have a negative impact, which must be offset by 5307. And so I think we need to look at that, how we cooperatively can help one another get on the same footing with reporting, such that we can actually maximize the amount of money that the region receives. I think that the other thing that strikes me in this process is that Mecklenburg County does have a different contribution level, in that they have a sales tax contribution into their transit. And I certainly think that Union County and Idle County should at least consider the possibilities for the future in enhanced transit and in transportation in our area, to consider a cooperative effort on that level. But I guess that's perhaps a different discussion that'll come from regional transit. But at this moment, I think that that's a quantum leap, but what we need is just a small quantum leap in terms of how we report and fund in the 5307 category to everybody's benefit. Otherwise, I think it's going to be very difficult for our smaller transit facilities to get the funding they need. And you do need it. There's no question about it. Your service to our region and the public is invaluable. And so I hope that we can all look at it from that perspective and devise the best possible strategy to get there.
I heard an intake of breath. Does somebody want to speak?
I guess the only thing I was going to add is that, given the amount of time it may take to reach out to some of these agencies and collect data, that if you wanted to have a presentation from the regional transit study that the COG is undertaking, we could probably arrange for that so that we could spend one of these sessions focused on what data they've collected, what discussions they've had, and kind of where they are and what their goals are at the end of that process, so that it could kind of play into our next step of consideration for any changes to the formula or what we're heading toward as a region. So
David, what you're saying is, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was done. Sorry.
That might be a good presentation to give to the whole CRTP board rather than a subset.
Yeah, and I think that they have done that, but we could, we definitely arrange for it. I think they did one to the MTC recently. Maybe that's what I was remembering, but absolutely. No, they did it. They do it to the TCC, Bob, this last TCC.
Yes, they did. And it's on the board agenda too for the 18th.
Okay.
Good segue.
Okay.
And Bob, is that the 18th of November?
Yes, November, next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's a public meeting, is it not? So any of us can attend it?
Absolutely.
And what time is it?
6 p.m.
All right.
Are you starting? Oh no, because the MTC meets that night too before, so we'll be trying not to overlap each other.
Why don't we try why don't we agree as a task force, and I'm talking about the primary members of the task force, why don't we agree that, we'll try to tune in, that's live streamed on the website, if I'm not mistaken, for Carpo. And we can all just, I'm going to be, observing that program, because I just think, if we can inform ourselves and educate ourselves, then not only will we be able to make better decisions locally and collectively, but then each of you has got to go back and talk to your constituents too about these issues, right? So you want to have as broad a knowledge base as you can. You don't have to become an expert, but I think everybody on our call from a local agency is someone who needs to be informed. So I don't mean to tell you how to do your job. Please don't take it that way. But I think the better informed we are, the better job we'll do for our communities and collectively.
And before we leave, I have two announcements. The Section 5303 call for projects for fiscal year 2022 is out and it's listed on the CRTPO's website. I'm sending the link for everyone. It's in the chat box. Also, Rutgers National Transit Database is offering a free 4-day course. I sent an email to, I believe, all the core members of our task force. I can resend it again. It's basically going to be offered in the early part of December. It's covering the basics of reporting as a transit operation, particularly for urban data reporting. And this is very crucial and very important. It's 2 opportunities to take the courses starting December 7th through December 10th. And then again, they're offering it in January, the 11th through the 14th of 2021. And these are 4-day courses, and you do need to attend all 4 days to get all the necessary information involving how to accurately report urban data. It's free. You don't have to pay for it because you're a public entity that's funded by the local government. And I would strongly advise everyone who deals with this to partake in these courses because Rutgers is directly funded by FTA for this program. So you're not going to get hearsay. This is straight from the horse's mouth by them.
Thank you, Jarrell. That sounds like a great opportunity for everybody. Well,
Okay.
how do we close out today? I am going to be following up, as I said, sending out the report, getting a couple more volunteers to help me and Jarrell do our 5307 research. As much as possible, we'll try to attend that Carpo meeting on the 18th to hear the COG report on the transit study. And I guess we'll be doodling for purposes of our next meeting date. But does anybody else have anything for the good of the order before we wrap up?
I did want to, since I told Ron, he'd asked a specific question about the reduction piece. I told him I could show him where in the spreadsheet that doesn't happen. I know we're wrapping up. What I'll do is send a link to a meeting that I could host with Ron and anybody else that would want that, and I could bring that spreadsheet up and walk them through it and show them how it works to get to that information. Janet or Teresa, if y'all want to attend that, I'll be happy to set that up for Friday sometime if that would work with y'all.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Our leaders, Michael Johnson, Dr. Mike, Linda Paxton, and all of our task force members, thank you so much. And Jarrell for helping us with the program. And David, big thanks to you for taking the time to present this information today. I hope
Mary,
it's been
this
helpful.
is Richard from Mecklenburg. I just wanted to say thanks to everybody. I don't sit in a lot of meetings where the whole time is useful, but I do have to say that this was very useful and it's good information. And I really do appreciate people sharing their knowledge and information.
Wow. High praise. Thank you. All right, everybody, let's go about our business and I'll be in touch. And questions, concerns, please let us know.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And yes, David, that was a great presentation.
Thank you.